All right, welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 15.5, and I'm going to make a kind of I guess you would call it kind of like a mid episode correction, and I think it's warranted in this case because Miss Paisley made something known to me, which is that Syd probably was using Richard Wilhelm's version of the I Ching, and reviewing some of the wordings within Richard Wilhelm's version, I think that Paisley is quite correct. It's actually quite obvious that Paisley is correct. So, for example, a few of the discussions or ideas that are mentioned are going and coming without error. That's mentioned in the song. 7 is the number of the young light. These are all lyrics that are directly tied to the Richard Wilhelm version of the I Ching. Now, they also interpret Fu as a symbol of return or a turning point, and this is kind of embodied within the idea, I guess you would say graphically, of the hexagram that's presented, and I suppose it's significant in a way that it is a hexagram. If you are someone that has studied some of the symbology behind esoteric sciences, you'll recognize why that may be, I guess, a coincidence of sorts that the I Ching is using hexagrams, whereas other forms of esoteric beliefs also use hexagrams. So, and 7 being the number of renewal or change. So now this version specifically calls out the month of solstice from December to January as being a period of renewal and healing, which may have been important to Mr. Barrett. And of course, we'll come back to this in his later songs, but it is called out specifically as winter solstice. So my previous episode 15, where I said that he was adding winter solstice, but it's not in the I Ching, is incorrect. It's not in my version, perhaps, but it is in this version. So, and I do think it is valuable to compare the two versions and kind of assimilate them because they are translations. So there's going to be some ideas in one that are presented in Richard Wilhelm's version that aren't presented in the version that I possess. Now, we do know, of course, that Mr. Barrett chose to leave Pink Floyd or was pushed out of Pink Floyd, depending upon the version that you want to believe, around December of 67, or perhaps in early January of 67. He may have been deliberately causing that to happen due to a reading. Perhaps he felt the need to go heal. Perhaps he felt that it was warranted and he wanted to progress through this process, and he was specifically calling out this hexagram as the return, and in a way he's prophesying. It's funny to me when people prophesy things that are under their control, because I predict that I'm going to eat dinner tonight. It's not really much of a prophecy, but the idea that someone's prophesying a return or noting a return, and then, as we mentioned in the episode, that seven measurement time period, which could be 7 years before he comes back. If he does do that, to me, there's nothing odd about that at all, other than he's specifically following a regimen. To actually follow a regimen that you've self-prescribed is not denoting any form of incredible gift or anything extraordinary or any circumstance out of control. It's something that is directly under a person's control, and they could easily accomplish. The most interesting facet of that to me is that someone would actually think in those terms, that they would think in the terms of a 7-year period and then correspond that to a hexagram. Now, this Richard Wilhelm version actually breaks down each one of the lines. We've already discussed how the I Ching works in the previous episode, so you build from the bottom up. So there's a solid base, and then there are a series of returns. So 6 in the second place means quiet return, good fortune. Third place means repeated return, no blame. Fourth is walking in the midst. One returns alone. Fifth is a noble-hearted return with no remorse. And the sixth is a disastrous return. So misfortune from within, without, etc., etc., and important, disaster for the ruler. So there again is a reference to monarchy or king. So disaster for the king. And if Mr. Barrett is referring to himself, and we've seen him refer to himself in these terms as a form of royal metaphor of some kind, then he could be kind of stating that this final return will be a defeat and there will be no other interaction. So if a person wants to interpret that as meaning that his final return with the band was at the Wish You Were Here recordings, then perhaps he recognized that and it was intended all along, and that would be the final return, whatever that means, which would of course imply that there were previous returns during that 7-year period. Now, the other thing I'd like to address real quick is the idea that perhaps someone should or shouldn't make acknowledgments of their errors. Now, I've made previous videos where I mentioned that I really don't like extremely polished videos that people make. And the reason for that is because they are portraying excellence without error. And that is not that is not an intellectual or an artistic process. And to me, those things are very similar in that you have to be willing to make errors and allow things to progress to create something of value. And if that process is not portrayed properly, it can give people the experience that perhaps they shouldn't try to do things unless they're going to be perfect. And I really don't like that. I think people should embrace the idea of making mistakes. One of my favorite painters was Bob Ross. He would constantly make mistakes and kind of laugh about them and then paint over things. And oil painting in general to me is pretty forgiving because you can, much more so than other things like watercolors. And perhaps I'm just not very experienced with watercolors, but my experience with trying to watercolors, it's extremely frustrating because it's difficult to correct errors in watercoloring. So the idea that a person should be able to make mistakes and acknowledge them, and if you are able to do that, then perhaps it is of more value to the people that, or to other people that are attempting to go through a similar process. And that is in every facet of life. So not just with creating art, but in dealing with problems and dealing with relationships with one another, etc. I think that, at least for me, I have had a very constrained idea of what a person's interaction should be like, how mistakes should be avoided. But I don't think necessarily that that's true anymore. I actually think that making mistakes in relationships with people is a very valuable thing, and perhaps people should embrace that a little bit more. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is because one of the questions that I've had for a long time, and I haven't had the opportunity to get into this yet, is the sloppy editing and putting together of Mr. Barrett's solo work. And we'll get into that with the songs later. But I do wonder if it wasn't deliberately done. And if it wasn't deliberately done to kind of show people how to go through that process, maybe I'm overthinking that and it was just sloppily done. It's hard to say. If it was just sloppily done, then it seems almost vindictive in a way. But I do wonder if there wasn't a part of Mr. Barrett that just wanted to relay very simple things and include them in a non-cleaned up, non-edited, purely original, purely organic way. And that's captured in his solo albums later. So that's pretty much it. I don't want to talk about this too much. I'm going to put out another episode pretty soon on Bike, and sorry, but that's going to be, I suspect I'll rate that one as an adult because it has a lot of discussion about psychedelics. So that's all for today. Talk to you folks later.